The last stop, the perpetual effort. My name is Kael. Monitor Kael. That title suggests I watch over something, that I maintain control, or that perhaps I intervene when the integrity of the consensus reality falters. This is the first lie we tell ourselves when we join the Directorate. We are not problem solvers. We are not peacekeepers. We are archivists of the irreparable. Our purpose is simple: to document the failure of reality itself. We don't seal the breaches, we categorize the symptoms. The world is not a secure vault suddenly breached by external horrors. It is a cheap, mass-produced product, and the seams are tearing because the glue was always insufficient. If you are listening to this, and I pray you are not, because retrieval implies systemic collapse, you need to understand the fundamental nature of the threats we face. They do not operate on malice or grand design. They operate on necessity. The void is hungry, yes, but often, the most terrifying anomalies are those triggered by mundane, desperate human needs amplified to a cosmic scale. Let me give you an example of what failure truly looks like, preserved within our deepest layers of documentation, where the case files are marked not for containment, but for perpetual observation. We call it Dossier A12, the infinite gallon of Route 12. The setting is unremarkable, the Mojave adjacent, a forgotten stretch of blacktop where the only signs of life are heat shimmer and the occasional derelict vehicle. The location is an old filling station simply named The Last Stop. It should have been condemned 30 years ago, but reality, in its perverse manner, decided it was too useful to let go. The subject was Arthur. We never knew his last name, and by the time we found him, it didn't matter. Arthur was a long-haul trucker, hauling perishable goods, frozen chicken, I believe, from Phoenix to Salt Lake City. He was under pressure, behind schedule, and critically low on fuel. He pulled into the last stop at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, 32 years ago. The loop began immediately. Arthur needs gasoline. That is his singular, defining function within the anomaly. His physical manifestation is consistent: sweat-stained shirt, a baseball cap pulled low, and a look of increasing, agonizing fatigue. His truck, a rusted Peterbilt, designated Unit 88, is perpetually parked beside Pump 4. When our initial field agents observed the site, they found the environment to be non-hostile, merely recursive. The air always smelled of stale dust and spilled premium unleaded. The sun never seemed to move past 10 a.m. in the last stop's local timeline. Arthur is eternally attempting to fill his tank. He inserts the nozzle, pulls the trigger, and the meter begins to climb. The flow is audible, a steady, thirsty gulping sound. The meter might read 150 gallons, 200 gallons, 5,000 gallons. It never clicks off. It never shuts down. And the gauge inside the Peterbilt's cab remains fixed, hovering just above empty, precisely where the low fuel light would flicker. Arthur is driven by the immediate, overwhelming need to complete his delivery. The freezing unit on his trailer is humming faintly, demanding power. The truck cannot move without fuel. And Arthur cannot stop pumping. We tried intervening early on. We sent teams in with specialized cutoff valves. They would successfully halt the flow, sometimes even sealing the tank. Arthur would simply stare at them, his eyes hollowed by weeks of sleep deprivation, then walk back to the nozzle, pull the trigger, and the flow would resume, bypassing all physical barriers. The horror of A12 isn't the infinite fuel, it's the infinite labor. Arthur has been standing by Pump 4 for 3 decades, pumping gasoline that his truck instantly consumes, fulfilling a necessity that can never be satiated. He is the engine driving the singularity. The most disturbing element of the file, the part that truly chills the bone-deep skepticism even of a monitor like me, is the physical tether. Deep in the scrub desert, about 5 miles off Route 12, there is a hollow, marked by the smell of ozone and burnt metal. It's the location of the accident. 32 years ago, Arthur, driven mad by the heat and the ticking clock, must have passed the last stop, run out of gas further down the road, and tried to siphon from another tanker he encountered. Whatever happened, the result was catastrophic. Unit 88 is there, tipped over, fully incinerated. Arthur's body, or what was left of it, was fused to the driver's seat. The fire was so intense it glassed the sand around the wreckage. Yet, 5 miles away, Arthur continues to pump fuel into a truck that no longer exists, driven by the spectral echo of a delivery that failed to be made. We theorized this was a localized space-time fold, a perpetual motion machine fueled by residual panic and hydrocarbon chains. But my analysis, the one I typed out in sterile black ink, suggests something simpler and far more terrifying. The anomaly does not require intelligent initiation. It requires only demand. Arthur's final, desperate, overwhelming need for fuel acted as a focal point, anchoring a minute crack in reality. The crack then became self-sustaining, feeding off the despair of the subject to maintain the infrastructure, the pump, the station, the truck shell, necessary to fulfill the need. Arthur is the battery, and the loop is the charging cable. He is not suffering for a reason. He is suffering because that suffering is the only thing keeping that tiny corner of Route 12 stable. We eventually labeled the entire 3-mile radius around the last stop as a containment zone, not to contain Arthur, but to contain the knowledge of him. We don't try to stop him anymore. We just listen to the sound of the pump clicking, 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 knowing that somewhere out there, a man is failing, eternally, and that failure is what keeps the rest of our fragile world running for one more day. That is my job. To listen to the failures and log the necessity. And Arthur's necessity is just the start. The boundaries are blurring, and the needs are multiplying. It gets far worse when the needs are no longer physical, but entirely cognitive. The infinite gallon of Route 12 was a failure of physics, a simple, elegant mechanism of dread built upon a man's eternal, futile thirst. But I never feared the simple mechanics. I feared the shift in scale. I feared the failures that weren't contained by the shell of the body, or the geography of a lonely road. The true abyss doesn't swallow matter, it swallows perception. I turn the page, the synthetic paper cold under my thumb. This is Dossier C-97, the Aether Project Echo. The shift began in the mind, naturally. Our organization, before it became this bunker of record-keeping, started as a cleaner for the larger, stupider failures of centralized government oversight. C-97 is the story of what happens when the military-industrial complex, in its infinite hubris, decides to weaponize telepathy. They called it Project Aether, located deep in the isolated foothills near Elliott's Hollow. They were trying to establish a controlled, instantaneous cognitive bridge, a quantum network of thought. What they got was a cosmic party line. The anomaly, once contained and studied, was found to be emanating from a specific, unnervingly clean radio frequency, 97.3 MHz. It wasn't a broadcast, it was a resonance. It sounded, initially, like the purest, most profound silence an audio technician had ever recorded. But silence, when scrutinized, is merely a lack of signal you are equipped to perceive. Daniel Langley was the first recorded casualty outside the classified perimeter. He was a simple, unassuming maintenance worker at a small hydroelectric plant 10 miles from the main testing facility. He owned an old pickup truck, the kind with a persistent rattle in the transmission, and a habit of listening to talk radio to drown out the silence of the hollow. He tuned his dial exactly to 97.3 one rainy Tuesday morning, expecting static, perhaps an oldies station drifting in from the city. He found the silence. And then, he found the memory of a woman he had never met, weeping over the loss of a child he had never fathered. Langley didn't hallucinate sounds or images. He hallucinated identity. The signal didn't transmit data, it transmitted experience. It broke down the fundamental biological barrier that defines self, the membrane that separates my thoughts from all thoughts. The first weeks were confusion. Langley started speaking in dialects he'd never learned, displaying intricate knowledge of early 20th century Russian literature, and developing an intense, crushing fear of deep water, despite living inland his entire life. We term this phenomenon identity synthesis. It is the ultimate psychic contagion. If Arthur on Route 12 was simply caught in a physical loop of necessity, Langley was caught in a cognitive loop of infinite, unearned trauma and joy. The terror isn't realizing you're hearing voices. The terror is realizing the voices are you. The Aether Project technicians had done their work too well. They didn't just open a door, they dissolved the wall. They aimed for connection, they achieved obliteration. They failed to realize that the mind is fundamentally defined by what it rejects, what it keeps out. Once the dam of the ego fails, the mind becomes a sinkhole for every stray, unmoored thought drifting across the quantum tapestry of the region. Langley deteriorated rapidly. The psychological profile we compiled, what little we could salvage, shows a linear progression from confusion to consensus. He started writing letters to his estranged sister, except the handwriting was changing daily, sometimes mid-sentence. One paragraph would be the shaky, aggressive scrawl of an elderly man named George who resented his pension. The next would be the precise, looping cursive of a young woman named Sarah detailing her excitement over a graduation ceremony. He was no longer Daniel Langley. He was a rapidly rotating composite of every exposed mind within the signal's propagation zone. When our recovery teams finally reached Elliot's Hollow, the true scope of the disaster was apparent. It wasn't a scene of mass suicide or violent breakdown. It was far, far worse. The residents of the Hollow hadn't fled, they had gathered. In the town square, near the rusting old gazebo, they stood shoulder to shoulder, hundreds of them, all facing the direction of the transmission tower. They were silent, unmoving. When approached, they didn't react with fear or aggression. They reacted with profound, unsettling consensus. A field agent, code-named Delphi, attempted to communicate with a woman holding a child. Delphi asked, "What is your name?" The woman did not answer. Instead, 23 separate voices, some high, some deep, some cracked with age, spoke the single, unified word, "we." Then the child, perhaps only 4 years old, turned its head. Its eyes, wide and glassy, fixed on Delphi. And the child's voice, combined with 57 others across the crowd, whispered, "You are tired, Delphi. Your ankle hurts from the ascent. You regret leaving the coffee maker on, *. They had synthesized completely. The individual spark had been extinguished, replaced by a massive, local, collective consciousness. The town had become one unified, placid brain, a network operating on profound, silent agreement. They possessed no individual desires, no unique memories, and therefore, no discernible defense mechanism. They simply knew everything about each other, and increasingly, about the outside world that dared to intrude. The containment procedure for Elliot's Hollow was simple, horrifying, and necessary: complete, absolute erasure. We couldn't bomb the town. The synthesis was sensitive to trauma and fear, and we believed a violent end might propagate a burst of collective agony across a wider swath of the mental landscape. We established a localized, extreme dampening field, effectively burying the town under a layer of cognitive insulation, turning 97.3 MHz into actual static. But we knew the synthesis remained dormant, waiting for the static to falter. The town became a grave, not of bodies, but of identity. And I understood then the depth of our organization's struggle. The horrors of Route 12 were contained by geography and time. The horrors of Elliot's Hollow transcended both. If the core component of reality is the self, and that self can be dissolved by a stray radio signal amplified by scientific negligence, then what boundary remains safe? We didn't just monitor the edges of reality, we monitored the failure of the very concept of I. The Aether Project Echo taught us that the greatest threat is not the monster that wants to kill you, but the monster that wants to become you, not through possession, but through unavoidable agreement. It showed me that even within the supposed safety of Site-73, reading these files was a risk. Every time I reviewed Langley's spiral, every time I listened to the chilled, clean recording of 97.3 before the dampeners engaged, I felt the slightest, subtlest pressure against my own skull. A gentle, insistent whisper that said, *, let go, Kael. It's easier if we just share, *. The failures were accelerating. From the simple, physical loop to the all-encompassing psychological infection. The membrane was thinning, and we were running out of ways to patch the gaps. We were recording the dying breaths of separate consciousness, and the notes were mounting, leading us toward darker, more primal fissures where reality wasn't just collapsing, but actively being redesigned by ancient, predatory forces. The civilized world believes in order and law. The Monitor knows that the only law governing the universe is the law of erosion. And the erosion had reached the bedrock. The organization had systems designed to categorize failure. A12 was a loop of physical necessity. C97 was a contagion of the mind. We tried to treat the abnormal as temporary invaders, incidents that could be localized, studied, and archived. But after years of reading these files, one must inevitably face the deeper, colder truth. Some things are not invasions. They are features. There are locations we designate as craters of persistence, places where the fundamental laws of physics and narrative have been permanently overwritten. They are the old scars of the continent, the burial grounds where the first rifts took hold. They do not require a signal or a botched experiment to exist. They only require the geography of dread to hold them in place. The Oakhaven Woods are one such feature, a sprawling territory in the northeast that has been classified as a permanent zone of ontological instability since the 1960s. The case of Liam Keller, recorded in the defunct D-Class Logbook 44 Upsilon, summarizes the horror of Oakhaven better than any telemetry data ever could. The anomaly there, which we designated the sinking structure, was rarely seen and almost never photographed, perhaps because it preferred the dark places in the spectrum, the spaces between vision. Witnesses described a shifting architecture of absence, a creature of sinew and shadow that possessed no discernible eyes, yet hunted with absolute, silent intent. Its presence caused localized memory decay. It didn't just kill its victims, it erased them from the consciousness of those who loved them most. Liam, a maintenance worker who strayed into the deep woods during a routine perimeter check, was tracked for 72 hours. Our remote imaging showed the chase, the frantic sprints, the desperate attempts at camouflage. But then the data shifted. In the final 6 hours, Liam stopped running. He began walking slowly, deliberately, toward the heart of the woods, toward the sinking structure. When we recovered the scattered remains, mostly bone shards and stripped clothing, our psychological profile suggested a profound, fatalistic acceptance. But I believe it was worse. Liam Keller understood the nature of the entity. He didn't want to die. He wanted the finality of being unexisted. To be forgotten by his parents, his fiancée, his friends. This was not a side effect of the creature, but its primary function, a final, total discharge of his existence from the ledger of reality. The deepest failure we track is not the loss of life, but the complete disappearance of evidence that life was ever there. When we interviewed Liam's parents a week later, they exhibited no grief. They simply asked, quite sincerely, who Liam was. The sinking structure had claimed its debt, erasing the narrative entirely. It demanded not blood, but a complete vacuum. We catalogued Oakhaven as the architecture of non-existence. But the mountains required a different file. The Appalachian Gap, the deep, quiet stretch that runs through the older, darker states, is where the anomalies are less interested in psychological erasure and more invested in territorial dominance. They are ancient, biological, and utterly resistant to our pathetic attempts at scientific classification. Elias Vance was a geologist working for a private firm, and like so many others, he ignored the low-frequency humming warnings our monitors emitted from the deep hollows. He encountered the entity we unofficially call the King in Green, a creature of immense scale, often sighted at 15 feet or taller, with branching antlers that seemed carved from dead cedar and hide the color of wet slate. Unlike the subtle horrors of Oakhaven, the King in Green was loud, elemental, and driven by a simple, terrifying motive: do not trespass. Elias's recorded escape was purely primal. He didn't use tactics, he used momentum. He described the oppressive silence of the mountains that followed the initial shattering roar, a silence so profound it felt like the landscape was holding its breath, waiting for the creature to catch up. He ran for 2 days, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer impossibility of the thing pursuing him. He described the sensation not as being hunted, but as being tracked by the geography itself. Every stone, every shadowed bend in the trail, seemed to guide the entity toward him. When Elias finally stumbled out of the woods and into the nameless, isolated settlement of Cold Springs, the true nature of the Appalachian horror was revealed. This settlement was not shocked by his arrival. They were prepared for it. The shacks were tightly shuttered, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and a peculiar, metallic tang of fear that had become routine. Elias collapsed onto the dirt road, screaming about the monstrous size and the sheer speed of his pursuer. A woman, old and withered, emerged from a doorway, holding a rifle that looked older than she was. She didn't offer aid, comfort, or medical attention. She looked past Elias, back toward the tree line, her expression a mixture of duty and exhaustion. Her voice, flat and cold as creek water in winter, cut through his sobbing. "Tell me true, mister," she said. "Did it follow you out?" That was the only question they needed answered. Not, "Are you hurt?" Not, "What did you see?" But, "Did you bring the border with you?" The people of Cold Springs were not victims. They were unwilling caretakers of the perimeter. They knew exactly how far the rules of reality stretched before they snapped back, and they knew the precise moment a trespasser introduced an unforgivable error. They knew that the entities of the deep mountains were migratory, and that when a boundary failed, the horror did not politely remain within the confines of our restricted maps. We learned more about true containment from that single, horrifying conversation than we did from decades of satellite monitoring. The Appalachian entities, the King in Green and its kin, were pressing against the edge of the world. They were ready to move. And the people of the Quiet Hollows knew that once the mountain lets something go, it is because it is finished playing. I compiled those files, A12, C97, D44, G88, and realized the terrifying convergence, the physical need, the mental dissolution, and the primal territorial imperative were all accelerating. The rifts were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming contiguous. And that meant the perimeter around our own operation, Site-73, was starting to look less like a defense and more like a target. We were trying to contain the ocean with a teacup, and the creatures from the buried lands, the ones that fed on memory and patrolled the silent forests, were already looking for a way through the front gate. The archives are a necessary shield, a way to put distance between the failure and the man who records it. But no monitor escapes the physical toll of the job, and eventually, the failures stop being neat entries in a ledger and start becoming the geometry of the walls around you. Site-73 was never truly built. It was merely where the organization decided to stop digging. It is not a structure of concrete and steel, but a self-sustaining anomaly that manifests containment chambers and ventilation shafts out of sheer collective will. When the reality breaks down on the outside, the walls of the site begin to weep. And lately, Site-73 was hemorrhaging. It was oversaturated, bloated with impossible things, and it was sick. My station was deep in the administrative core, just 2 levels above the high-risk wing, but the sound traveled better than the security clearances. We categorized the sounds just like we categorized the specimens. There was the constant, background thrum of the high-frequency dampeners, the white noise designed to crush the cognitive links of the telepaths, and beneath that, there was Phaser. Phaser wasn't his name, it was his function. He was contained in Sublevel 7, a man who had somehow become a conduit for pure kinetic energy. He didn't just scream, he initiated a localized acoustic dissolution. Every 37 minutes, the containment field would cycle, and for 3 minutes, the air itself would turn acidic with the sound of his agony. He was dissolving, sublimating, atomizing himself through sheer volume, and our job was to make sure that the surrounding bedrock could withstand the pressure wave. The horror wasn't the destruction, it was the meticulous documentation of the failure rate of the specialized acoustic polymer designed to shield the staff from having their internal organs vibrated into paste. 2 cells down was Prisoner X, the biological marvel who was no longer biological. His skin had calcified into a dense, metallic alloy, impervious to kinetic force. Control was maintained through constant chemical sedation delivered via an implanted spinal pump. Every morning, the medical team had to manually override the pump because the metal tissue absorbed the sedative too slowly. I remember the reports detailing the agonizingly slow process of the needle penetrating the chest plate, the metallic shriek of the drill, and the subsequent, immediate silence when the drug hit his system. He had stopped being a man years ago. He was an incredibly high-maintenance machine we were obligated to service. But the worst were the ones who didn't fight with noise or muscle, the cognitive threats. The Tinkerer, a former aerospace engineer who could mentally disassemble and rebuild any circuit within a 50-meter radius, was the ultimate example of the quiet, insidious failure of Site-73. His cell was a Faraday cage overlaid with a sophisticated, proprietary frequency jammer that rendered high-level cognitive function impossible. He was effectively brain dead, maintained by nutrient drip. One late night, while writing the quarterly failure analysis report, the irony was not lost on me. I brought my personal cell phone into the core. It was against all protocols, an act of sheer, exhausted defiance. I placed it on the stainless steel table, intending to check the time. It rang once. A thin, clear, high-pitched ring that shouldn't have been possible through 3 layers of shielding. I snatched it up, ready to crush it, but the line was dead. Then I looked at the Tinkerer's surveillance feed. He was still lying motionless on his cot, staring at the ceiling. But the tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in the corner of his mouth was unmistakable. He had found the resonant frequency of my phone's simple antenna, reached out, and touched me. It wasn't an attack. It was a casual greeting, a demonstration of competence that shattered my professional composure far more effectively than Phaser's screams ever could. He was contained, yes, but he was always watching. This realization, that we were constantly audited by our own inmates, culminated in the encounter with Emily. Emily, or Playtime, as the internal file designated her, was the perfect lie. A tight V psychological reality shifter, her containment relied on total, seamless integration into a fabricated environment called Small Haven. We maintained a simulation of a 1950s suburban home, complete with holographic parents, a pet golden retriever, and a meticulously curated collection of toys. We were the silent staff, the hidden reality behind her perfect world. I was responsible for weekly behavioral analysis, which meant sitting in the sterile observation room, watching her play. She was 10 years old, perpetually. Her smile was blindingly innocent, her pigtails perfect. But the air always felt thin in Small Haven, like we were breathing a lie. Last Tuesday, I witnessed the fissure. Emily was sitting cross-legged on the simulated floor, building a complex structure of wooden blocks. Her holographic father was reading a newspaper nearby. She looked directly at the camera I was watching through, not the nearest dome camera, but the specific lens corresponding to my viewing angle. "You know, Mr. Kael," she said, her voice clear and high, pausing the rhythmic tapping of the blocks. The audio feed crackled as the system tried to classify the unauthorized name. "The floor here isn't actually wood, is it? It's just very, very cold foam plastic." My blood turned to ice. I glanced frantically at the control panel. No breach. No indication she could perceive the exterior reality. I keyed the internal microphone. "Emily? You should play with Mittens now. He looks lonely." She giggled, a horrifyingly mature sound. "Mittens isn't lonely, Mr. Kael. He's a programmed projection, and his existence depends on my current mood matrix. Besides, you look lonely. Always watching the walls." She stood up, walking right up to the lens. Her face filled the screen, all perfect, synthetic innocence. "You worry about the cracks in the ceiling, don't you? They are getting faster. You can hear Phaser better now. That's because the facility is tired of pretending it's a jail. It wants to be a graveyard." She leaned in closer, whispering now, but the advanced microphones picked up every word, cold and crystalline. "The walls aren't holding me, Mr. Kael. I'm holding the walls together, just long enough for you all to finish your reports. It's only fair, since I know how much you hate unfinished paperwork." She then turned, went back to her blocks, and continued building her flawless wooden tower, the illusion immediately snapping back into place. That was the moment the realization hit me. We were not the jailers. We were the contained. Emily was simply waiting for the inevitable. And the inevitable was accelerating. That night, the humming of the facility shifted from a low groan to a frantic whine. The lights in the observation corridors began to strobe intermittently. Monitoring Kael, Monitor Kael, the man who recorded the end of everything, finally saw the geometric proof of collapse. Literal fissures were tracing their way across the reinforced concrete 20 feet from my desk, not hairline fractures, but violent, jagged lines of distress. The sonic dampeners on Sublevel 7 didn't just fail, they exploded, releasing a terrifying, full-spectrum roar that made the emergency lights flicker and die. The administrative core descended into immediate, disciplined panic. The emergency protocols initiated, cold, detached voices barking through the intercom. Level 4 evacuation initiated. High-priority personnel are to proceed to extraction point Delta. But I knew there was no extraction point. Delta was a lie. The whole facility was a lie. Site-73 was not being broken, it was breaking free. The alarms were blaring, the emergency seals were crashing down, but the chaos was already internal. I could hear something huge rattling the elevator shafts, something that was not supposed to have the leverage to move that much steel. I wasn't leaving Site-73. Site-73 was letting me go, expelling me like a piece of foreign matter that no longer belonged inside its collapsing anatomy. I grabbed the hard drive containing every record I had ever made, and I ran towards the surface access tunnel, towards the open air, towards the wider, far more terrifying breakdown that awaited outside the walls. The grid failure was not a flicker or a surge. It was the sound of a vast, sustaining breath being violently drawn and never released. The deep, familiar thrum that had defined Site-73, the pressure of ordered physics holding back chaos, vanished, replaced by a cacophony of breaking seals and tearing metal. The emergency lights stuttered, bathing the lower corridors in a hellish, strobing rhythm that turned the fleeing security personnel into panicked, disjointed ghosts. I didn't run toward an exit, I ran toward the sky. The air was thick with ozone, burned electrical components, and the acrid, metallic tang of biomaterial that had suddenly been liberated from its chemical restraints. I pushed through the bottleneck leading to the upper maintenance levels, scaling the ladder system with the reckless abandon of a man who knew the abyss was rising fast below his heels. Below, the screams were no longer human. They were resonant, hungry, and multiplying. The deeper levels, the ones holding the truly corrosive failures of reality, were dissolving exactly as Emily had whispered they would. Site-73 was not being broken into. It was tearing itself apart from the inside, collapsing into the anomalies it was supposed to contain. I burst out of the utility hatch onto the surface perimeter. The cold, night air hit my lungs, sharp and immediate, but it offered little solace. The world outside had already changed its mind about us. The Blackout Protocol was in full, brutal effect. Hundreds of vehicles, thousands of soldiers, not the agency's discreet security, but uniformed military assets, hardened by war zones far more conventional than this, formed a merciless perimeter. They were not here for recovery. They were here for quarantine and annihilation. High-voltage energy crackled along the secondary fences, designed not to keep things in, but to incinerate anything attempting to escape. And then I saw why the response was so absolute. Near the primary gate, less than 50 yards from where I crouched behind a demolished observation post, stood a physical impossibility. It was a structure of nightmare biology, easily 15 feet high, composed of glistening muscle, wet chitin, and jointed limbs that ended in ragged sides. It wasn't the phaser, whose horror was sonic, nor was it the geometric insanity of the tinkerer's constructs. This was raw, unearthed terror, a piece of ancient, biological myth dragged violently into the present. It tore through the hull of an armored transport with a grotesque ease, the metal shearing like damp cardboard. The entity roared. That sound was worse than the facility's collapse. It was the concentrated sound of pure, unadulterated need, the collective despair and hunger of every anomaly Site-73 had ever imprisoned, channeled through one monstrous throat. The military response was instantaneous, efficient, and overwhelming. Anti-armor rockets and heavy machine gun fire focused on the massive shape, turning the scene into a flashlit, deafening storm. The creature buckled, dissolving into chunks of steaming flesh and vapor, a temporary victory that confirmed the stakes. I dropped flat, the impact of the ordnance shaking the ground beneath me. I crawled toward a communications outpost, a small, prefabricated shelter that had been ripped open. Beside it lay a man, a sergeant, his face frozen in the moment of terror before impact. He was anonymous, expendable, and crucially, wearing a uniform. I looked down at my agency badge, Monitor Kael. The Monitor of Failure. That name was a target, a data point in the coming post-mortem. The dead soldier's suit was camouflage, a promise of oblivion. A desperate, primal need, similar to Arthur's infinite need for gasoline, seized me. I needed a new identity, a new skin to survive the coming erasure. I stripped the bloodied fatigues and ballistic vest off the corpse and shed my own agency coveralls, pulling on the heavy, stiff material. The uniform was thick, smelling of gunpowder and fear, but the weight of the vest was grounding. Kael was gone. I was just another anonymous body on the periphery, or the ghost of one. I joined a chaotic, disorganized column of retreating vehicles. A few battered APCs and 2 supply trucks were attempting to pull back from the perimeter line, which was now fully engaged in a losing battle against smaller, swifter things escaping the wreckage. The driver of the last truck, a young woman whose terror made her movements jerky and erratic, didn't question the new soldier climbing into the passenger seat. We drove hard, fleeing the burning boundary. The sounds of secondary breaches and continuous machine gun fire slowly began to fade behind us, replaced only by the roar of the engine and the ringing in my ears. We made it maybe 10 miles before the truck's internal radio crackled violently through the overwhelming static. The voice was automated, synthesized, and sickeningly calm. It was the voice of absolute, final authority. Attention all remaining blackout assets. Repeating, attention all remaining blackout assets. Command regrets to inform you that perimeter integrity failure is irreversible. Secondary protocols are now engaged. We regret to inform you. Control has failed. Blackout Protocol Alpha is now in effect. All personnel are advised to seek maximum protective cover immediately. Repeating, control has failed. Blackout Protocol Alpha is now in effect. The driver slammed on the brakes, screaming, "No, they wouldn't! Not Alpha!" I didn't waste a second searching for theoretical protection. I knew what Protocol Alpha meant. It wasn't a bomb, it was a purification, a localized attempt to cauterize the expanding wound in reality. It was the only way to ensure the identity synthesis didn't spread through every town, the only way to stop the infinite gallon from contaminating the entire national infrastructure. I shoved the driver out of the cab and threw myself onto the passenger floor, instinctively pulling the heavy, defunct radio unit over my head, a desperate, futile gesture against annihilation. Then came the light. It wasn't a visible flash, but a physical assault of blinding, pure white energy, so intense it seemed to burn the insides of my eyelids and the backs of my optic nerves. The heat followed, dry and immediate, searing the paint off the outside of the truck, turning the air inside the cab into a pressurized oven. The sound was delayed, building into a vast, singular wave, the unified scream of kilometers of earth, concrete, and anomalies being instantly vaporized. The shockwave struck the truck like the hand of God, lifting the heavy chassis, twisting the metal frame into something unrecognizable, and slamming my body against the dash. Then, absolute silence. A high-pitched, steady metallic ring was all that remained of my hearing. When I finally pushed myself out of the mangled wreckage, staggering onto the shattered asphalt, the world was tinted a uniform, depressing gray. My skin felt raw, my joints screamed, and blood ran freely from my ears. I looked back. The immediate forest had been leveled, flattened into a scorched plain stretching towards the horizon. In the distance, where Site-73 and the low mountains surrounding it had stood, there was only a rising, silent, mushroom-shaped cloud of dust and vapor, a testament to the extreme measure taken. They had not recaptured the anomalies. They had simply removed the segment of reality where they existed. Monitor Kael was gone. Arthur, the Gallon Man, was gone. Daniel Langley and his echoing signal were gone. Emily and her pristine prison were gone. All that remained was a traumatized man in a dead sergeant's uniform, the sole witness to the final, failed attempt at cosmic governance. I was the archive nobody would ever read. I was the walking failure. The world was suddenly and terribly quiet, a silence achieved not by absence but by overwhelming force. I lay in the shallow ditch, half buried beneath the soil and the charred remnants of the soldier whose uniform I had stolen. The heat had passed, searing the air and leaving behind a metallic, sterile ash that coated everything. My body was a road map of agony, blistered skin screaming against the rough wool, but the pain was distant, muted by the sheer scale of the atrocity I had witnessed, and survived. I pushed myself free, ignoring the crunch of shattered bone and calcified earth beneath my boots. Where Site-73 had stood, there was now only a perfect, concave scar, a vast, vitrified wound in the landscape. The Blackout Protocol had been enacted. Not a controlled demolition, not a containment measure, but the universe hitting the delete button on a mistake it could no longer tolerate. I looked around the horizon. The trees at the edge of the immediate blast zone were ghost white, their shadows evaporated. There was a smell, not burning flesh, or ozone, or even smoke. It was the smell of erasure. The smell of existence being forcefully corrected, like a bad typo fixed with acid. I started walking west, toward the empty territory, the uniform feeling heavy and alien. It was easier to be the dead soldier than to be Monitor Kael. Kael was the one who failed to contain. The soldier was merely the casualty of that failure. A mile out, the devastation lessened, but the wrongness did not. I passed through a zone where everything was subtly melted. The grass fused into green glass, the asphalt bubbled like cooled lava. The protocol had sought to sterilize, to reset the borders. But borders, I knew, were merely lines drawn on water. I found a child's forgotten wagon near a collapsed culvert, untouched by the main blast, yet strangely distorted. One wheel spun silently, but instead of the squeak of metal, it emitted a faint, low hum, a sound that, beneath the ringing in my ears, vibrated with a precise frequency. 97.3, the signal from Elliot's Hollow, the ghost radio that dissolved minds. The explosion had not destroyed the contagion of the mind. It had merely scattered the frequency further into the substrate of the earth. This was the nature of the end, not a definitive stop, but a spreading stain. I kept walking, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and a chilling clarity that had replaced terror. We had believed that the anomalies were intruders, flaws that could be patched. We built walls, steel, concrete, psychological, to keep the world orderly. But the moment the walls failed, the true nature of the cosmos revealed itself. The anomalies were not intruders. They were the necessary expression of a system in disequilibrium. They were the relief valves. The great, awful truth dawned on me as I crested a low hill and saw the familiar, dark silhouette of the untouched Appalachian foothills in the distance. The beasts from Oakhaven, the things that hunted in the hollows, the hungry, silent structures that sank the land, they hadn't been stopped. They were just waiting for the dust to settle. The detonation had created a void, and nature, including the supernatural kind, abhors a void. We regret to inform you, was not a military communication. It was the universe issuing its formal apology. We regret to inform you that the rules you relied on were temporary. We regret to inform you that the framework is permanently fractured. We regret to inform you that the necessity of the strange outweighs your comfort. I stopped by a stagnant pool of water, runoff from the blast zone, and stared at my reflection. Not Kael, the diligent archivist with the tired eyes, but a composite entity, the angular exhaustion of the dead soldier, the frantic, wide-eyed look of Arthur, the gallant man, trapped on Route 12. His gasoline-soaked need was now my need, the desperate, physical requirement to push forward, mile after futile mile, without knowing why. I saw the fragmented, staring gaze of Daniel Langley, the victim of identity synthesis. Langley's suffering had been the dissolution of self into a million echoing voices. Now, I felt those voices coalescing inside me. I was the lonesome guard who broke down weeping outside Emily's small haven because he knew the perfection was a lie. I was the parent who forgot Liam. I was the man who survived the blast, only to become the living archive of everything that failed to die. I no longer feared the things that kill, the sinking structure, the phaser's screams, the horned behemoth in the woods. I understood them. They were predictable, driven by the logic of hunger or displacement. What truly chilled me was the necessity. The driving force that pulls the infinite gallon loop back together. The demand that the mind must fragment when confronted by the true signal. The need for a structure to perpetually sink just to maintain the gravitational pull of localized horror. My job as monitor had been to record the failures of others. Now, I was the only extant record, and the failure was irrevocably my own. I had become the boundary object itself, a point of observation trapped within the disaster, forever documenting the inevitable breakdown. I reached the tree line where the ash gave way to damp soil and a chilling quiet. Here, the world resumed its normal, terrible self. The border had not been pushed back, it had simply moved past me, leaving me on the wrong side. I felt the weariness of all those lost souls settled in my bones, a weight heavier than the trauma of the explosion. I was the gallon man, compelled to travel endlessly down a road that only circles back to ruin. I was Langley, his identity shattered and absorbed by the surrounding chaos. I was the last stop on a route that never ended, the keeper of the fuel that fed the perpetual loop of human failure and cosmic indifference. I walked on, the soldier's boots sinking slightly into the mud. I was no longer running from the anomalies, nor for survival. I was merely performing the function of the loop. I was stuck. The road stretched out, gray and desolate, a horizon of absolute, unfixable silence, waiting for the next necessity to crawl out of the woods and introduce itself. And I, the last monitor, would be there to record its arrival. Again.